Raven, Swordsmistress of Chaos, written by Richard Kirk. Prologue. The hut settled against the bare ground like a hunched beast, crouching under the lee of a stone fall from the farther edge of the promontory. It was set apart from the others, though like them in construction, a crude affair of bent wood and roughly cured hides. The wind howling in from the dark sea tugged at the hides, playing fitfully with the pale glow of the tallow lantern that was the only illumination within the dark interior. The hut was cold and damp, and not even the furs piled around its earthen floor warmed the occupants enough that they felt comfortable. One young man fumbled a pile of twigs into a cone, striking his tinderbox to light the wood. Others passed a stone jar from hand to hand, sucking enthusiastically on the fiery contents. In the cold times, inner fire might serve in lieu of real comfort. They wore furs, the three young warriors, and small pieces of metal and chainmail, little tidbits of armor looted from dead men. They carried swords of a dark metal that were never far from their hands, but their eyes were fixed face of the man seated across the growing fire. He was old, his upon the face lined with the deep cracks of age, his skin spread taut over the fine bones of his skull. A mane of silver hair cascaded from his high-domed forehead onto his broad shoulders, bunched in now against the cold and the inexorable the years. His eyes, though, were bright, darting pale blue parks through the faint light, seeking out each watching gaze passage of and holding it as a stalking ferret holds the rabbit's eye in hypnotic trance, bending it to the hunter's will. He was very thin even amongst a company of men starved of meat, and his clothes were rags and furs that spoke silently of better days, long past. On the earth beside his left hand rested a great sword, its blade shining silver in the growing light, the hilt wrapped round with golden wire. A huge green gemstone set into the pommel. His right hand was bound in rough bandages, the contours of the dirty cloth showing where his fingers had been severed from the palm. He smiled and began to speak. You laugh at me. I know that. Youth is a gift that can afford laughter. When the arm is strong, the lips stretch easily, for a woman, a clean kill, a blue sky, an old man. I am old now, but once I was young like you, and as foolish. I gave up more than you whelps will ever dream to know. Once I sat in halls of marble, their pillars girt with gold and precious stones. The food came on platters of silver, roasted meats and spitted birds, pure bread and fruits long forgotten. Cheeses and wines nursed carefully as the offspring of a chieftain, in the good times. The old times, you hairy savages are too young to remember, though I do. I cannot forget. Shroud of the stone, I wish I could, it would make this damp exile easier. But what can an old man do? He sits in his cold and stinking tent wondering where his next meal will come from, remembering things best forgotten. The timeless blue eyes glazed over, though whether from pain or delight, it was impossible for the young men to guess. They continued to pass the stone flask around, watching the old man, waiting for him to continue his story. At last he nodded, pointing the stump of his hand towards them, and spoke again. She was a woman, Raven. There are none like her today. Tall, she was, her hair as golden soft as the sun on a late summer evening. And her eyes blue as a mist-kissed sea, blue and green and grey mingled together in a manner that could suck the soul out of a man, if she chose. Though I've seen them red with blood and cold as the wind from the northern ice wastes. She was a woman you whelps might dream about. Damping your blankets with the thought. She smiled as she killed, and if she chose a man, he went to the furs ready to die for sheer pleasure. 2 men only, in all the hundreds she slew, could stand against her. I was one, and I still bear the scars of knowing her, albeit they are gladly borne. The other was Carl Don Wayne, and if he went to the hell he deserved, I trust his soul rots there, for he did her a mighty wrong. Not even the omnipresent sorcerers of Carwin would degrade a woman so. But I ramble. Don Wayne is long ago fed to the worms. So, too, is Raven, unless she survived that last Armageddon battle. I know not, I fell there, and Gondar took my hand. I never saw her again, except in dreams. Perhaps dreams are the best way to remember. Now, the wind renewed its attack on the hut, howling through the seams of rough-tied skin like the keening of a widowed woman. The fire sparkled, struggling against the draft, and the lantern flickered shadows over the watching faces. They were tensed, now, staring at the empty blue eyes that looked into a distance reaching beyond the goat-hide hut into an age gone down into chaos, reaching out for a dream, a memory, a woman. She was a woman, a swordmistress, too. But always a woman. Raven, we called her. I shall tell you how she got that name, tell you of our first meeting. 1. A tool must be chosen carefully to effect a successful pattern of creation. Only the finest will suffice. The books of Carwin. The girl crouched on the moonlit sand listening to the baying of the slave hounds. The unearthly howling seemed to match the heaving of her air-starved breasts as they thrust again the skimpy Lyandian cotton of her shift, moving the soft material over the cuts decorating her lithe body. The cuts hurt, and she could feel blood thickening along her back and buttocks. She ignored the pain, thrusting to her feet, steeling her body to make the impossible effort of outrunning the slave hounds. Once she had seen the hounds bring down a runaway slave. The man had broached the walls of the lion slave pen at noon, trusting in the desert sun to keep the guards asleep. He had omitted remembrance of the dogs. And along the high picketed walls, there were small exit holes that allowed the gaunt, gray beasts ready access to the blank wastes beyond the walled city. The hounds had gone out, 3 of them, with weird, unholy cries, their great red-lipped jaws slavering a joyful anticipation of the unexpected sport. They had brought the man down in sight of the city, and the slave guards had lined their squads upon the wall, to watch. The hounds stood high as a man's hip and their mouths were lined around with ivory fangs that pierced flesh as easily as a Terwin saber. They were near as fast as a Zand, and they had brought the runaway down no more than a quarter cleave from the walls. They had played with him for too long. The girl rose up and ran. She ignored the pain that seemed to shred her feet to bloody, spore-filled ribbons of blood or the desert land of the southern kingdoms. She ignored the aching agony that threatened to burst her lungs beneath her jouncing breasts. She ignored the stinging pain of the lash marks. She ran. She could imagine the slave hounds at her rear. Even feel in her mind the wet painful kiss of those great jaws, the ivory fangs closing and tugging on her skin, shredding and ripping until she was brought down, yet alive, for the sport of the hounds and their lioned masters. Terrified, hating, she ran over the sands surrounding the great walled city of Lion, heading towards something. She had no clear idea of what it might be, knew only that she must escape the slavery that had destroyed her parents. And never again face the lash. Behind her, the slave hounds closed in, they spread out, the 6 of them, into a confining semicircle. It was a pattern bred by the expert slave masters of the city. The hounds ran down their prey until it was weary, then they moved out to form a horned pattern, so that the victim ran within a half-circle of inescapable pursuers. Then the slave hounds completed the circle. And fed. The girl wanted no part of that dread circle, and yet saw no way by which she might escape it. Lacking plan almost. Lacking thought, she ran as an animal runs, blind, desperate, seeking only the unattainable. Her feet thudded over the burning sand, hot even now in this southern clime. Her eyes darted around the moon-washed dunes, seeking a refuge she knew could not be found, but she refused to give in. She had no hope, nor any weapons except her soft limbs. But she would not resign herself to death any more than she would agree to slavery, the whip and the brand. She ran. And the hounds drew closer. Their baying wafted on her ears, culling the night sounds from the desert until there existed only the weird howling, and the soft swift pad of stealthy feet. She sensed, rather than saw, the shapes close in around her, but the waft of fetid breath, the clacking of the fangs, they were real enough. Then, out of the darkness, came a great black shape. Slavering jaws spread wide to take her, and she hurled herself away, tumbling hopelessly over the sand as huge, clawed paws drew fresh blood from her skin. She screamed, for raw fear is a hard emotion to suppress, and rolled down the dune towards the waiting, gaping eyes glowing crimson in the waning light. She came to her feet and clenched her fists, knowing it was useless, nothing could stand against the slave hounds of Lion. But still she rose up and readied herself to die, hoping to hook one hand at least into the eye sockets of a demon dog. The slave hound sat back on heavy-muscled haunches, their tongues lolling out from between curved teeth. Their eyes were red with bloodlust, an almost human sadism glinting in the scarlet orbs. Their waiting was their undoing. Had they charged in, they might have changed the course of history, cut a line of evolution off from its start, ended an empire and given birth to a new order, but they were trained to wait, to anticipate, to savor. And so they failed. They closed in slowly around the panting, helpless girl, their great jaws gaping wide to rend suppliant flesh, crunch bone, teach suffering to a recalcitrant slave. And the girl watched them come, prepared to sell her worthless life as dear as she might, knowing she had no hope, that no benevolent god would stoop down to lift her clear of the slavering death surrounding her quaking body. But then something came. Perhaps not a god, but equally effective. It came out of the night, and it was black as the night, so black she could no more make out its shape than she could tell what it did. All she heard was the sudden yelping of the slave hounds, howls of rage and squealings of pain, whimpers of fear and barks of frustration. She saw a blackness dart across the moon, plummet downwards. A larger shape rose into the sky, split apart, one section falling as the other swooped towards the nearest slave hound. There was a howl of agony, close followed by a second, and a sound of wings beating like war drums on the desert air. She smelt blood, thick and salt as the cuts on her back, and knew that something attacked the dogs. It moved faster than any beast she knew, turning in one black wing beat to rake talons over the muzzle of a darting hound, lifting to drop a moon-brightened beak to the eyes of another. Then back into the air, and down again, beak and talons and wings flailing like a hellstorm around the slave hounds. 4 of the great beasts added their blood to the shadows on the sand. The remaining two turned tail and ran, pursued by the thing. She could give no name to it. Only feel gratitude, allied with fear, for she had no idea what it might be, nor if it fought to save her for itself or herself. She climbed to her feet again and began to run eastwards. She ran until she could move no more, until her watered eyes glazed over and her breath came like liquid fire into her lungs. She had no idea where it was that she fell and slept under the lee of a tall dune, nor whether the black night thing watched her. She simply collapsed and gave herself over to sleep. It was a slumber troubled by dreams. Visions of the slave hounds mingled with the lofting walls of Lyand, the spired city fading into the faces of her parents. Zahn, her father, lips twisting as the slave master's brand bit redly into his flesh, her mother, Kara, screaming as the mercenaries took her one by one. The long lines of wharf slaves padding down to the harbor. The snarling dogs and the barbed whips holding them to their shuffling pace. The clanking of the chains. The stink of the pens. The soft hands of the overseer. The harder touch of Carl Ir Don Wayne. The sting of white-hot brand on flesh. And she woke gasping, with sweat on her brow, and a chain around her ankle. There was a face smiling down at her. It was a fat face surrounded by greasy curls that tumbled over golden hoops to the black silk shoulders of the man's robe. The gold rings that were set into pierced ears, and the curls were flecked with twists of bright ribbon and tiny spangles. The widespread lips were painted red, the laughing eyes shadowed with kohl. His right hand clutched an ornate saber, the hilt and tang chased round with silver workings. The tip rested beside her throat. She cursed silently, recognizing a Karsam eunuch. Pretty, pretty. The neuter's voice was a sibilant chuckle that belied the strength in his sword arm. A pretty little gift for the Altan. A bath, a little perfume, a clean robe. Worth 10 kush at the least. I am free. Her voice was both demanding and frightened, anger mingling with abhorrence and terror. I am no slave to be taken in the night. Let me go. The saber moved to prick a droplet of blood from her neck. And the eunuch's smile changed slightly, becoming malignant. You are a slave. He dropped the sword to lift a fold of her shift from her thigh, exposing the brand. You bear the mark of Lyand. He chuckled. But you are far from Lyand. The walled city holds no sway out here on the eternal sand. Here you belong to whoever finds you. The slave hounds I heard baying last night, the vultures or me. You survived the beasts and I set the anklet on you. You belong to me. The girl started to answer him, using every foulness heard in the slave yards, but the eunuch set the point of his sword between her lips so that it pricked her tongue and she fell silent for fear of losing speech altogether. Listen to me, girl. His tone was almost friendly, betrayed only by the cold hate in his eyes. Were I yet a man, I'd take you here and now. You're of the age, and you're pretty enough. That golden hair, those thrusting buds, they excite a man. The Altan will welcome you to his bed. And it's a deal softer than the sand or a vulture's peck. The chains are on you, so make the best of it. Or die now. He withdrew the saber, letting the tip rest lightly against her left breast. The girl sat up, staring at the golden ring that held her ankle. It was very fine gold, and from it ran a slender chain that linked her to the next girl. There were 20, she noticed, all watching her, their expressions alternating between the hope that she would resist and die, and a bored resignation. She shrugged. She had little hope of freedom now, and a Karsamian bordello was a better fate than sand or slave hounds. I will go with you. She said it proudly, as though agreeing to a journey rather than bending to a command, and the eunuch laughed. Thank you, he giggled sarcastically. You are kind to us with your company. I, Ariella, chief slave master of the Altan stable, welcome you. Prepare to march in 1 hour. He lifted the saber from her body and walked away, chuckling enough to flutter the black robes girding his bulk. The girl let her head droop back, silently bemoaning her brief won freedom. High above her, floating on the clear desert sky, she saw a black shape. And shuddered, though she knew not why. In the hot light of the after dawn, they struck out across the sands. The girl was one more stumbling figure in the line. The golden chain riveted to her ankle ring connected her to the girl before her, and she was the last in the slave line. The column stretched out before her, the shapes of the farthest women wavering in the heat haze lifting from the tropical sand. Around the column went the slave masters, sitting comfortably on the heavy Karsamian saddles of their sturdy horses. Like Ariella, they were dressed uniformly in black silk and armed with curved sabers. In addition, now, they carried 3-tongued flails of knotted leather. The flails were used to urge on those captives too weak, or too obstinate, to match the pace of the chief slave master, around whose saddlehorn was wound the end of the golden slave chain. The girl cursed him as she marched, matching each step with an obscenity. But she kept pace, and never felt the lash. There was little point in fighting the inevitable. until some chance offered itself. They marched throughout the long morning, halting at noon to rest and drink. No food was given them, and little water, just enough to keep them alive and capable of movement. Those skin shades were set up to protect them from the burning sun. They waited until a second slave train joined them. This one was comprised of men, mostly Ishkarian and Zandronian males, though the girl glimpsed the odd blonde hair of a crag reaver amongst them, and a few black-skinned slice. The outriders were much thicker around that train. Restless horsemen pacing the line with lances and sabers drawn, and the three-tongued flails fell heavier across the shoulders of the men. When the sun shifted downwards they started out again, the new line of marchers held a good half-clee from the women. They moved through the afternoon, halting at sunset to eat and rest through the cold night. The girl woke with a strange luminescence paling her face. It appeared as though the moon had come down to the earth and lit her with a cold radiance that both excited and stilled her. She was unable to move her limbs, and when she cried out there was no stirring among the watchful guards. She felt curiously warmed, as though bound in heavy furs, and she could not draw her gaze from the strange light. She closed her eyes, assuming that she dreamed. And a voice came into her mind. Tomorrow, it said, be ready. You are chosen, and you shall be free. When the time comes, move fast. The Black One will help again, but most depends on you. The when of it, I cannot give you, the certainty, I promise. Be ready. She turned restlessly, images of revenge seeping through the fibers of her mind, filling her with a comforting warmth that slid her back into sleep whilst leaving the message imprinted stark upon her consciousness. She woke warm while the others shivered from the night's chill. And ate a breakfast of porridge and water, rising to her feet while the others still slumped in the chains, unwilling to go on until the eunuchs applied the flails. They marched as they had on the previous day, but now the girl paced eagerly over the hot sand. She could no more explain why than she could understand the curious certainty of her message. She only knew that she must. It was, she thought, as though one of the ghost priests of Carwin had spoken to her, a sorceress demon being from the Isle of Ghosts. One of the lost ones whom people said were evil or good, according to the turn of their fortunes. She, though, knew the voice had filled her with hope. It was good. Why, she could not say, only know that she must walk ready. When the sun was preparing to settle beyond the ridge of the farther dunes she knew why. A dark-fletched arrow took Ariala from his saddle, choking him on his life's blood as he pitched down with the shaft protruding from his chest. 3 more slave guards fell with the black shafts sticking from their bodies, and then the sand came alive with leaping figures. They seemed to erupt from the ground itself, leaping out of the earth with straight-bladed swords carving a swath of death amongst the eunuchs. Terwanian steel clashed on riveted warshields, horses screamed as black metal blades cut them down to bring the riders in range of the shorter swords of the raiders. The high-pitched yells of the dying neuters rang against the fading sky, and bloody swords lifted in grim triumph. Half a clee away, the heavier guard that surrounded the men was going down into bloody ruin. Here, the ambushers were more cautious. They used their arrows to bring down most of the armored guards, closing only when they were sure of victory. The screams of the dying guards delighted the girl. She watched the raiders with admiration. They were tall men, for the most part, tanned by sun and by wind, their faces lined and seemed as though accustomed to living in the open. They wore shirts of linked mail and cuirasses of stone-hard xanthide. Their shields and bucklers were of metal and cured skin and wood, their swords boasting a myriad origins, from the straight-bladed stabbing swords of Sarah to the scythe-like blades of Zandrone. The bows were of Ishkarian origin, and the cleaving broadswords spoke of Crag and Varthan, amalgamated. They spoke of death. They spoke of it in many ways, and very bloodily, and when it was finished the sand stank of it, so that the girl gagged and choked, for she had never smelt it or seen it in this way before. She tugged at her anklet, striving to break free before some new master might claim her, and then he came out of the sun's set, the dying radiance surrounding him with an aura of burning gold, so that his helm shone bright as the rune-graved breastplate he wore, emphasizing the macabre shadows of his helmet where the eye holes stood bright dark from the pale-washed blankness of its face. Tall, he was, and wreathed in iron and bronze and steel, the broadsword in his hand dripping bright blood, the droplets falling to the laughter that rang from his face-hiding battle helm. This one. His voice was a ringing cry, overriding the moans of the dying guards, a bull roar of command that brooked no defying. I'll take this one. Around the girl, the battlefield fell silent as bloodied men paused, staring towards their leader, magnificent in his stained armor, broken from their own pursuits to notice what had caught his attention or whom. Then one voice sounded. Quiet, it was, and soft, yet tinged with the same impenetrable vein of defying hardness that marks the cut of flint through softer stone. No. It was said quiet enough that some missed it, turning to ask what had been stated so firm that the reavers halted their looting and waited for the answer. But it stopped the warrior in his tracks as surely as a steel-bound buckler might halt his sword. Who says no to Arger? The blank visage of the war mask turned, surveying the field of battle, and the broadsword lifted, ready to strike again. I do. The voice remained soft, but now there was a figure to which it might be attached. Striding from amongst a group of slaughtered eunuchs with bright blood coating his sword, and, more on the facing of his round war shield. He was tall, even in the company of tall men, and pale, as though the desert could make no impression on his skin. A silvered helmet protected his skull, nose and cheek plates hiding much of his face, though the girl could see his eyes and his mouth. The eyes were of a translucent blue, the color of a summer sky when the sun beats hot enough to bleach the azure from the heavens so that they appear almost silver. The mouth was wide, full-lipped and hard, set in a determined line that etched a shadow across the beardless jaw. He was dressed in black armor, his Zandian cuirass dark as a moonless night, the link mail covering his arms and legs forged black. The knee-high boots of soft ear leather matched the darkness of his other gear, and the long, straight sword he carried was of black quan steel. His shield was of the same metal as his helm, glinting bright silver in the sun, engraved with symbols she could not read. She watched, waiting, as the two men faced one another. Then the sword of the first warrior drooped and a laugh bellowed from his helmet. So, Spellbinder. You'd have her for yourself? The black and silver man shook his head slowly. No, Arger. Not for myself, then why? Shades of the gods, man, I'll share her with you if you wish. The silvered helm moved from side to side. The mouth smiled, half friendly, half resigned. It's for her to decide, Arger. But she is no outlaw's bedmate. This one bears a higher destiny. She'll bed you if she wishes, but I'll kill you if you try to take her by force. Kill me? Doubt tinged the mockery of the outlaw's voice. You think you could, I? And you know it, perhaps. Steel to steel it would be an interesting combat. But where's the sense? The bloodied broadsword dropped to bury its tip in the sand. I'd as lief fight you as I'd kill my brother. And I have a feeling seated deep in my gut that you might win, if not by the sword. Then by your sorcery. The one called Spellbinder laughed, and it was a sound of humor tinged with sadness, as though he knew the outcome of such a combat and preferred to avoid it. He sheathed his black sword and clapped a hand to Arger's armored shoulder. Free them, old friend, and let's away before some patrol happens upon us. Arger turned, shouting orders at his waiting men, and they set to breaking the golden slave chains, ushering the women and the male slaves off towards a nearby ridge. The girl was one of the last to be freed, though she scarcely noticed the cleaving of the anklet. Her eyes were fixed firm on the face of the black and silver warrior. In turn, he appeared to study her with inexplicable interest, as though he had found some long-sought treasure of unguessable value. She waited for him to speak, wondering what prompted his curious interest. It was clear that the lust she had roused in Arger was not shared by this one, or if shared, controlled with care. He looked the kind of man to rule his emotions with a firm will, unlike his outlaw companions, and she felt a strange, instinctive kinship. He sheathed the black sword and gestured for her to rise. Come. She followed obediently. The outlaws had horses concealed beyond the ridge, and those, together with the animals of the dead slavers, mounted most of the freed prisoners. The black and silver warrior lifted the girl onto his own beast, mounting behind her. There was something oddly comforting about the encirclement of his mailed arms, and she leant against him as they rode away across the sand. Behind them, kites and buzzards spiraled down from the sky, their raucous cries hoarse with anticipation. The outlaw camp was situated around a small oasis, tall palms growing from the luxuriant sward edging the water. Tents of green and blue and black were scattered amongst the trees, and guards armed with longbows watched their approach. The man had not spoken during the journey, and now he reined in before a tent of black silk, its sides marked with the same strange symbols that covered his shield. He handed her to the ground and tugged on the chinstraps of his helmet. When he removed the headgear, a mane of jet black hair tumbled around his shoulders, and he pushed it back with a long-fingered hand. He was, she noticed, exceeding handsome in a fine-boned way. Were it not for the steel in his pale eyes, and the firm, almost sad, set of his mouth, he might have looked weak in this company of fierce, hard-eyed men. This is my tent. His voice was soft and rich, its tone gentle. Inside there are clothes and perfumes. Dresses. Clean yourself and await my return. Oddly, she felt that his words constituted a request rather than an order. Should anyone molest you, tell them you belong to Spellbinder. She nodded, waiting until he turned away to unsaddle his horse before entering the tent. It was spacious and cool inside, rugs and cushions of bright colors giving a simple luxury. An awning of some material she had never seen before partitioned the rearward section, and behind it she found a tub and the promised unguents. With a delighted cry, she tore off her flimsy shift and sank into the water. To her surprise it was warm, and she wondered for a brief instant how the strange warrior had arranged for it to be heated. Comfort overrode curiosity, and she enjoyed the unaccustomed luxury with the unthinking pleasure of a happy animal. She had no idea how long she spent in the tub, for the water remained pleasantly tepid and then there were lotions and balms to intrigue her. After those, dresses of silk and fine-spun cotton, necklaces of silver and of gold, bands of platinum and precious gems to contain her hair, and rings of foreign design. She chose a dress of black silk that clung to the contours of her body, emphasizing the fullness of her breasts, the smooth, clean curve of her hips. It was sleeveless, and she set a silver torque about her upper arm, matching it with a heavy silver bracelet around her left wrist. A slender belt of platinum links encircled her waist, further emphasizing the enticing fullness of her hips, and she drew small sandals of black and silver over her feet. She left her hair free, so that it cascaded in waves of gold onto, and past, her shoulders. When she was done, she studied her reflection in a great mirror of polished silver, and wondered at the result. The reflection showed her a woman in the first flowering of her maturity. Little more than a girl, but shapely and sensual, a woman to please a man's eye. She had never worn clothes like these before, nor even seen some of the ornaments, but they fitted her as though the finest of Lyon's many fine dressmakers had worked long to suit her. She realized with a start of surprise, beautiful. Her own assessment was borne out by Spellbinder's admiring glance. The warrior was waiting for her in the outer tent, sipping a goblet of rich Saran wine. He, too, had changed his attire and now sat in a flowing shirt of black cotton, belted round with a wide swathe of black leather. He wore tight-fitting black trousers tucked into high, black boots, and his weapons and armor were stowed neatly to one side of the tent. A long-bladed dagger was sheathed on his left, and the girl noticed the hilt of a second protruding from his right boot. She smiled and curtsied as he rose to his feet. "Sit here." He filled a second goblet as she sank to the cushions. "There are things I would know about you. And things you must learn about yourself." Curious, she waited for him to continue. She felt safe, though she knew not why. The fate of a captured slave girl was usually preordained, life if she pleased the man who took her, at least until he grew bored, or death if she argued the rape. She had been prepared to die. Once was enough. "How are you called?" He asked it as though he knew already. "Suyuan." "No other name? No patronym?" She shook her head so that her hair flew around her eyes. "Slaves have only one name. So it goes." He smiled, and the smile seemed to light the dusky tent. "Your parents? You knew them?" "They came from Ishkar. My father was called Zahn, a farmer. My mother, Kara. She carried me when the Lion slave ship came raiding along the coast, so they let her keep me. I was born in the slave yards. When my father tried to see my mother, they took him away and killed him. I was still a baby then." Her voice was filled with bitter resignation. "The first thing I can remember is my father screaming as they branded him. They used the irons until he died. It was an example to the others." "Your mother?" His voice was gentle, comforting. "She lives?" "No." The girl shook her head, swallowing wine to drown out the hatred and despair. Lion was fighting Varthan and hired mercenaries. The soldiers wanted women. My mother was one of the chosen. They took her one by one and killed her for their pleasure. After that I was alone. Not now. You escaped. I. Better the desert than Carlisle. Don Wayne. Don Wayne? The pale face was abruptly intense, blue-silver eyes probing hers. What dealings had you with Don Wayne? What dealings has Don Wayne with anyone? Her voice was bitter. Destruction is his trade. Suffering, his entertainment. She paused, choking on the bitter bile of hatred that stopped her throat, her blue eyes staring at some vision of things past, things branded on her memory as sure as the brand upon her thigh. Carlisle. Don Wayne commanded the mercenaries who killed my mother. He remained in Lyand after the war was ended to become the city's weapon master. I grew, and Don Wayne saw me. He watched me after that, waiting for the years to pass, waiting until he deemed me ready. Then he took me. Her words, now, came from between clenched teeth and her voice grew flat. They called me from the slave pen one evening. The overseer had me stripped and bathed, dressed in a fresh shift. They lead me through the city to the weapon hall. Don Wayne waited there. He was drunk, his cheeks red with excess so the scars stood white against his skin. The overseer left me. Don Wayne tore the shift from me, and when I tried to run, he beat me until I bled. Then he raped me. He told me, as he did it, that he liked it better with the blood on me. The next day I was given a room in the hall. It was 2 levels from the ground and the door was locked. I was to await the pleasure of Carlisle. Don Wayne. Before he came, I risked the drop and fled. I climbed the wall and ran into the desert. I knew the slave hounds would be loosed, but even they seemed better than a life as Don Wayne's whore. It was strange. The hounds were on me when something came out of the night. A bird, something I cannot be sure, except that it saved me. I woke a prisoner of the eunuchs. The rest you know. I murmured Spellbinder, and perhaps more than that, even. Perhaps too much. He sat in silence for a moment, his eyes blank so that the girl stared at him, wondering what he meant. Then, soft and slow, he began to recite a verse as though chanting a litany. Out of Ishkar into Liand, squalling soft the baby comes, doomed to suffer, doomed to conquer, knowing not the sacred tomes. Life and death, they both are hidden, in the chosen, infant frame, new world born and old one dying, who to guess the godlike game? A chill that was both cold and simultaneously warm settled over the girl. She felt terror and joy, a great, overwhelming doubt and an uplifting wave of certainty. Though certainty of what, she could not guess. Spellbinder looked up. Smiling, his eyes suddenly clear again as though a decision had been made and he saw a path clear before him. You are no longer Suyuan, he said quietly, though his voice rang like a war bell in her mind. You are Raven. Raven, Chaos Bringer. The chosen one, she began to protest, unknowing the ordained pattern he described, aware only of a watershed in her life, that somewhere on the cosmic plane powers shifted and fell into place as though a great storm of mystic proportion gathered around her. Come. His voice was odd, yet commanding, and she followed him from the tent, outside. The night was dark and the wine-rich shouting of the outlaws rang loud around the oasis. Spellbinder lifted his arms to the sky and called something in a tongue she could not understand. There was a beating of wings, a hoarse cry that seemed to block out all other sounds. And from the night there descended a great black shape. Wings beat around her head, and she saw the flash of razor talons. The glint of curved beak. Then two eyes, red and fierce and knowing, peered at her. Something gripped her shoulder, but she ignored the pain, aware only of a strange inner strength. A weight settled upon her and she knew the great bird that had saved her from the slavehounds perched upon her shoulder. I, said Spellbinder with joy and fear in his voice. You are Raven.